Cops beat black woman until she makes one call to her father, the Attorney General. On a quiet suburban street in broad daylight, 3 armed officers cornered a bleeding young woman, their guns raised as if she were the greatest threat they had ever faced. Her trembling hands clutched a phone, her tear-streaked face scarred with fresh wounds, and every breath she took was a battle against fear. Neighbors watched from behind closed curtains, too afraid to step out, too silent to intervene. Just when it seemed her voice would break under the weight of despair, she whispered into the phone, calling the one man who could turn this nightmare upside down. Her father, the Attorney General of the United States. The afternoon sky burned with a merciless brightness, the kind of light that should have belonged to ordinary days filled with laughter of children playing on their front lawns, sprinklers casting rainbows across the trimmed grass, and neighbors mowing their lawns with headphones in. But instead, this same light now bore down on a nightmare that had spilled into reality, a moment so raw and violent that no amount of sunshine could disguise the cruelty that was happening in plain sight. And right at the center of it all was Alana, a young black woman whose every breath trembled with the weight of survival, her eyes wide with terror and glistening with tears as the sting of bruises and the taste of blood filled her senses, her body swaying as though the earth beneath her feet no longer offered balance, because just moments ago 3 uniformed officers, men meant to symbolize protection, had dragged her down like she was less than human, their shouts echoing in the suburban silence, their fists leaving marks not just on her skin but deep in her heart, the injustice of it louder than their commands. Around her, the houses stood still, blinds shifting ever so slightly as neighbors peeked and then retreated, not daring to face what they were seeing, as if pretending not to notice would absolve them of guilt. But the truth was their silence screamed just as loudly as the officers' threats, and in that suffocating silence, Alana realized she was utterly alone, her voice cracking every time she tried to plead, her sobs swallowed by the barked orders of men pointing guns at her fragile frame. And though daylight wrapped the street in clarity, it felt darker than any midnight, darker because there was no hiding this horror, darker because the cruelty was laid bare for anyone brave enough to open their eyes, yet still no one stepped forward. Not one person came running to her defense, and so she knelt on the hot pavement with her arms trembling, the heat of the asphalt biting into her skin, while fear flooded her chest in relentless waves, the fear that this was it, that this was how her story would end, not with dignity, not with love, not even with the chance to fight back, but with the cold judgment of strangers who had already decided she was guilty of something she never did. And as the ringing in, her ears grew louder and her vision blurred from tears and sweat, her hand began to search blindly, desperate, until it found the familiar shape of her phone. That small piece of metal and glass that in this moment felt heavier than any weapon, heavier because it carried the last thread of hope she had left. And though her fingers shook and slipped against the blood smearing across its surface, she gripped it with all the strength she had left, pressing it to her ear as she whispered words broken by sobs, words that barely made it past her trembling lips, words that carried her final plea into the air, because if anyone could save her now, if anyone could turn this nightmare into justice, it was the one man she had always known would never let her fall. The man who had taught her that her voice mattered even when the world tried to silence it. The man who, in this very moment, was about to hear the most desperate call of his life. Her father, the Attorney General of the United States. The phone pressed against Alana's ear felt like both a lifeline and a weight, every ring echoing louder than the shouting officers around her, drowning out the threats and the metallic clicks of guns being readied. And when her father's deep, steady voice finally answered, it was like oxygen flooding into lungs that had almost given up, his calm tone immediately cutting through the chaos as he said her name with the kind of urgency only a parent could. No, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Alana let herself cry, not the stifled sobs she had been choking back, but the raw, unfiltered tears of a daughter calling out for her father, her voice trembling, broken, whispering, "Daddy, they're hurting me." Words that cracked the silence of the street like thunder, and though the officers barked at her to drop the phone, though one kicked at her side in a brutal attempt to knock the device from her hand, she clung to it with a strength born from desperation, because she knew the man on the other end was not just her father, but the Attorney General of the United States, a man whose very presence in the government made even the boldest corrupt officer hesitate. And yet these men, blinded by arrogance and prejudice, had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea that their victim's last name carried a power that could shatter their careers, their lives, and perhaps the entire precinct's reputation. Alana whispered everything in fragmented sentences between gasps for air, the blows, the humiliation, the guns pointed at her, and though she tried to sound strong, her voice betrayed the child within her, the daughter who had always believed her father could fix anything. And in that moment, his silence on the line spoke louder than words, the silence of a man who was listening, absorbing every detail, his anger simmering beneath the surface like a volcano ready to erupt. But his tone, when he finally spoke, was sharp, controlled, and commanding, telling her firmly, "Don't let go of this phone, baby, no matter what they say. Keep it to your ear. I'm here with you." And those words gave her enough courage to withstand the officer's rough shove that nearly knocked her flat, her fingers digging into the phone as if it were her own heartbeat, while the world around her blurred into a haze of sirens, shouting, and the heavy thud of boots on pavement. But then, in the distance, another sound began to rise, a rush of engines, heavy tires screeching as black government SUVs turned the corner, their tinted windows flashing reflections of the sun. And for the first time the officers' confidence faltered, their shouting stuttering mid-command as they noticed the vehicles pulling up with terrifying speed. And though Alana couldn't see clearly through the tears clouding her eyes, she felt the shift in the air, the way the power dynamic suddenly tilted, because her father was no ordinary man sitting in an office miles away. He had moved heaven and earth the moment he heard his daughter's voice breaking over the phone. And now the world around her was about to witness the storm he could unleash, a storm so fierce it would make the three men who stood above her, with their guns drawn, wish they had never laid eyes on her, wish they had turned the other way, wish they had never mistaken her for powerless. The roar of engines grew louder, echoing off the quiet houses like a storm breaking over the suburbs. And as the line of black SUVs screeched to a halt, the officers who had moments ago barked orders and swung fists suddenly froze, their authority slipping through their fingers like sand, because the doors of those vehicles flung open with a force that sent shockwaves through the street. Men in suits pouring out with the precision and speed of soldiers, earpieces glinting in the sunlight, their presence unmistakable, the unmistakable aura of federal security that came only when someone truly powerful was in the mix. And Alana, still clinging to her phone with bloody hands, felt the vibration of the ground beneath her knees as boots pounded closer, a rush of movement she could barely comprehend through her haze of pain and fear. But what she did understand was the sudden shift in the air, the silence that swallowed the officers' shouts, the hesitation in their voices as they took an instinctive step back, and in that silence, broken only by the rhythmic click of polished shoes on the pavement, a figure emerged from the center SUV, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made the air itself heavy, and though her vision blurred, she knew that silhouette anywhere. It was her father, the man who had tucked her into bed with bedtime stories, the man who had lectured her about courage and resilience, the man whose every word in public carried the weight of justice. And now, for the first time, she saw not just her father, but the Attorney General himself, his face etched with fury barely contained beneath the mask of professionalism, his eyes fixed on the men who had dared to lay hands on his daughter. And the silence stretched for what felt like eternity until his voice cut through it, low, sharp, and commanding. A single word. Enough that made the officers flinch as if the ground itself had ordered them to obey. But still, pride and fear wrestled inside their bodies, one officer trying to speak, stumbling over his excuses, muttering about procedure and compliance, yet every syllable cracked under the weight of the truth hanging in the air. They had brutalized the daughter of the nation's top legal authority. And there was no way out of this storm, no excuse strong enough, no defense convincing enough, because their faces were pale, their hands shook slightly as they tried to keep their weapons steady, and yet even their guns now seemed useless, like toys compared to the sheer force of power that had arrived. Alana sobbed harder, her body shaking as the phone finally slipped from her grasp. But before she could collapse completely, strong hands lifted her, gently, carefully, arms she had always known as safe wrapping around her trembling frame, and, though she could barely whisper his name, her father heard it, felt it. And in that moment the world outside, the flashing lights, the stunned silence of neighbors watching through their windows, the officers shrinking beneath the weight of consequences ceased to exist, because for him, nothing mattered more than the broken, bleeding girl in his arms. And for the first time since the ordeal began, Alana allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was finally safe. Though the storm her father was about to unleash on the men who had hurt her was only just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the scars of that unforgettable afternoon began to fade, but the memory of it lived deep in everyone's heart, like a silent echo of resilience and pain, shaping how they looked at life forever. The young woman who had once stood trembling in the sunlight now walked with a steadiness that drew eyes not out of pity but respect. Her wounds no longer marks of weakness but symbols of survival. And the two officers who had once stood with weapons raised, embodying intimidation and power, were now shadows in a story retold again and again. Not as villains to hate, but as a reminder of what fear, authority, and misunderstanding can cause in a single fragile moment. Neighbors who had rushed out that day, their gasps filling the summer air, became storytellers of courage to their children, passing down the lesson that bravery does not always come from strength, but from standing tall when the world wants you to fall. And for the woman herself, every sunrise became a silent vow to keep moving forward, to live for something greater than fear, because though she carried the memory of guns pointed at her, what she truly carried was the fire that no one could take away, the fire that said she mattered. Her story mattered, and no one could ever erase it. This story is a reminder that no matter how dark or frightening a moment may feel, courage and resilience can turn pain into power. Life will test us, sometimes in ways we never expect, but strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing back up and showing the world that you cannot be broken. Let this be a lesson for all of us to choose hope over fear, compassion over judgment, and unity over division. Because together, we can create a world where no one has to stand alone.